Welcome to Grail Country. I am fortunate enough today to have two distinguished guests joining me. One is Dr. Anthony Baker, who you may have recognized from our previous discussion on hell and why he's not quite a universalist, and Jordan Daniel Wood, who's been on the program several times. And we're here today to discuss Jordan's book, The Whole Mystery of Christ, which Jordan and I have previously discussed. And so I'm not planning on being too much of a participant in this conversation and let my two distinguished guests discuss as much as possible. But essentially, this discussion came about because I saw Dr. Baker discussing Jordan's book on Twitter with John Milbank, and I'm like, hey, would you guys like to come and talk to Jordan? And we're still discussions are still in progress with Dr. Milbank, so hopefully he'll be on to discuss it at some point too. But Dr. Baker was available on a more immediate timeline, so this was the date that we managed to throw together. So the way I had envisioned this conversation going is that I'm going to actually have Dr. Baker open to give his impressions and thoughts on Jordan's book, and then give Jordan a chance to respond, and then we'll see where it goes after that. So with that said, Dr. Baker, why don't you first tell how you came to, you could first give a little bit of background. It's how you came to be reading it, when you were reading it, and then what your thoughts were as you were reading it, and then any questions that you have for Jordan after you've read it.
Yeah, sounds good. And Nate, thanks for having me back on the show for this conversation. Jordan, great to be here with you and to connect about this incredible project that you've devoted years of your life to, and that has now come to fruition. I'm constantly reading what I can about any of the major church fathers. I teach a course on the church fathers, and so I try to just work on those lectures and work on discussions and just try to know them inside and out as much as I can. But Maximus has for a long time just been the church father of church fathers for me. Just the depth of his inquiry, the philosophical chops he's got. There's a sort of beautiful spirituality to so much of what he writes, where he'll just sort of be working out, something from Gregory of Nyssa that you can't even figure out where he got the question from, and then suddenly he sort of got me in tears, because of something so moving he's just said. So love Maximus, So yeah, I think what my first post on Twitter about your book was that it's time to read Jordan's book to find out what all the hype's about, because I've been hearing about it for a couple of years now. When it was on the way out, and when maybe that the first Modern Theology article that you had came out, and I gotta say, I get it. I get the hype. I as soon as I started in, you're taking on the big names of Maximus scholarship, and not afraid to tell them what they're wrong about, what everybody has missed and what everybody has not taken literally, and you do that in a really in a compelling way. Where you're not just I think that was one of the first things that impressed me, was you were these weren't cheap shots. You were in some serious content arguments with some scholars, because you were preparing us for what it was that you wanted to say and to see the implications of it. So just really good writing, I think, is the first thing. I'm going to just tell you some of my favorite parts, and then I'll get on to some of my critiques, and we can play around with any of that and take the conversation wherever it goes. Nate even said if we take it close to Mary, he'll jump in the fray. So
yeah, I won't be able to resist.
I've got a little Mary note here. We may So for me, there were sort of, there was the big thesis, creation is incarnation. And then within that, there were sort of several supporting theses. You name many of these, but a few of them stood out to me. So if I'm reading from my notes here, if God doesn't change and the Logos is God, then creation is eternally within God. And I take that to be that's sort of a key argument that you're doing in various ways, and you're building it up, and you're coming at it and working on the parts. But there's a kind of obviousness to that once you say it, that it's just it's hard not to be persuaded immediately. Like, yeah, there's something here. If we're imagining creation as sort of temporal only and disconnected from the eternal Logos, then you've got to say something like the Logos gets some equipment that he didn't have in the beginning, or something like that. It's super clear. God's relation to the world. So a couple of points that work out of this. God's relation to the world adds nothing to the Father's relation to the Son. I think that's a really persuasive. You have a really persuasive way of getting at that idea. That there's that if the second person of the Trinity is eternally that hypostatic union of divine nature and human nature, then God's relation, there's nothing in God's relation to creation that isn't there, and vice versa, which is that's where you start to get to where scholars will be resisting, like, hold on, that I'm with you there, but can we also say God's relation to Jesus of Nazareth adds nothing to creation? Or God, the incarnate one adds nothing. God's relation to the incarnate one adds nothing to creation. That's one of the notes that I'd love to just hear you comment on, how you think about that. Love the big compelling idea. If everything created is incarnation, that everything created. Sorry, I love the big idea that everything created is incarnation. The Word of God is both made and unmade. That's a quote from at some point in there. Your language of deification was really rich, and a very carefully and studied way that you connect that to your interpretation of Maximus on sin and creation. The world is sort of not yet and no longer the true creation, and so deification is this process of world becoming creation again. I read the Jonathan Beeler critique in modern theology, and he challenged that idea, but I think he's wrong. I mean, I think you nailed it there. I think that's got to be right. And just the really, again, sort of careful and studied treatment of the relation of logos and logoi, which is obviously it's Maximus, it's key in Maximus, and it's also complicated. How as you say, there's not quite divine ideas, and we can't think logoi in a way that sort of lends itself to pure multiplicity or something like that. So that's all the stuff that I was sort of jumping up and down cheering as I was reading. Few sort of points that we can return to as you like of critique, questions built in. One is around participation language. You have your sense of participation is that it is can't remember the word you use, but something like it's coordinated by hypostasis. There is participation. Participation can't be the sort of the governing theological category, especially for Christology. It's got to be governed by that hypostatic union. That leads you to say, I think this is also a quote, Logos is God and world. And I want to say, I mean, you heard it in what I've already been cheering for, that Logos is God and world, but I want to say that in a particular way. Because if I don't say it in a particular way, it's going to start to sound sort of Nestorian. It's going to it's going to sound like God and world are two beings right next to each other, that the Logos is, and the Logos is both. Well, there's a sense in which the Logos is both God and world, but that's because the Logos is God. Uh, and everything that it is to be creation adds nothing to what it is to be God. So I think that's the right line, but I think that's got to be qualified. Logos is God in the world, but not in and the world, but not in such a way as they sort of sit alongside one another. That connects, as you point out, to the analogia entis conversation, and I think maybe for both a way to, I wonder, I like the language of patterns as participation language, and what I want to say is that there's no other way to be a nature than to follow the pattern of the divine nature. But then that's going to say something you don't want to say, which is that created natures participate in the divine nature. I don't think you want to say that. You've got them as incommensurables, which are hypostatically united, incommensurable natures. And that's I think a line that I used on Twitter with John was a risk of hypostatic voluntarism. What I mean by that is, if there's no similitude at all between those natures, and if the hypostasis is, as you say, indifferent and so totally inhospitable to created and uncreated natures alike, then that union is kind of, there's a sort of a sheer force of divine will, it seems to me, that makes the hypostatic union a hypostatic union. There's nothing, the divine nature has no sort of almost has no dog in, I'm sorry, the hypostasis has no dog in the fight. But then it's a sort of it feels like an external union at that point. They're sort of there. They both get to come in, but they have no relationship at all, except that they're in the same room. So that was part of my worry there. Connected to that is the asymmetry, the critique of asymmetry. I think what I was hearing in some of the text is the sort of you were using identity synonymous to the way that you were synonymous with the word union. I thought, and you can say more about that. I thought that's what I was hearing. So hypostatic union means the human nature is identical to the divine person. But union can't be simply identity, because that would be a sort of a Chalcedonian problem. All that language in Chalcedon about these are the limits on what you can and can't say about the way that the divine and human natures relate. I want to say, so the thing that the thing that you got my wheels spinning around, and this will be the last note here, is the way that tropos could, I think, do more work for you than you let it. You've got a really it's one of the key terms that plays through this, and then you've got that really nice succinct paragraph at the end about here's what tropos is, here's tropos in relation to logos. It seems to me that tropos could be a something like that pattern that I was talking about. So instead of the divine nature and the human nature in Christ are incommensurable but hypostatically united, you could say the divine divine nature has a suitability to the human nature because creation itself is patterned on the filial tropos. So you've got, so, what is it to be the eternal Son of God? It's to be it's to be God in a filial mode. And then why it, so why do the logoi come along for that ride? Well, yes, it's because they're hypostatically united, but that they are within that hypostatic union, they are, the one is patterned on one another. So creation itself has a filial tropos. It's a temporal filial tropos. But then that sort of tropological match allows the union to be something more than a sort of external holding tank for incommensurables. Some of my thoughts, some of my sort of salad of ideas that spilled into the bowl as I was reading and thinking through this with you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's there we go. So making sure this is on. New mic. Try to get the right button. You said I could call you Tony, so
right.
I will call you Tony. So thank you so much for all of that. Thanks for giving the time. I still continue to be surprised at the time people are giving to this. When you sit down to write, because this was a dissertation originally, when you sit down to write this, you're thinking I'm writing to like 7 people in the world who are going to want to read an appendix on Stropos and else, so it's really flat. It's like an honor to have people like yourself who have been in the game for quite a while, and you've got your own body of work, which is sizable, to engage this, which is just my first book. So I appreciate it, Tony, and I really appreciate the remarks. Obviously, I would love to high five all day about the things that you found, that you resonate with and you agree with. But maybe it'll be more useful if I focus a little bit more on the criticisms or the questions that you raised. And I think they're really good ones. They're ones that some of which I've heard from some other quarters, and I have been able to think about them a little bit in terms of, the gut reaction you want to have is to say, well, no, nobody's understood me, nobody gets what I'm saying or whatever. But at some point you really have to be self-critical and say, well, what maybe could lend itself to that, or maybe what could I have added or done differently or rethink. And so one thing that and you'll have to remind me if I forget some of them, but I'll stick with a few that I recall here off the top of my head. And I think they're related. The two I want to focus on are kind of like hypostasis as an empty signifier, or like a retainer or container, and then the incommensurables of natures on one hand, and then on the other hand, kind of the that I think that's pretty relevant to an analogia entis and asymmetry. So we'll start there before we go cosmic, so to speak. And so I think one of the risks that I took, especially in the first chapter, the Christologic chapter, which is just sort of trying to get at Maximus's Christology proper, if we want to put it that way, is that it does come across as like an almost like a sort of rigidly scholastic, schema almost of his thought on, what is person in relation to natures and activities, and then the perichoresis of these things and identity language and all that. And I think, and I like David Hartz, I think, raised some of these concerns as well, and John Milbank. And I think on the one hand, it makes sense what the worry is. The worry that hypostasis is empty because the nature is sort of right. It's distinguished in the Christologic. Initially, I distinguished very sharply between person and nature. Part of that is just I do think it's a necessity of not only Chalcedon, which distinguishes them, but also in view of the post-Chalcedonian critiques of Chalcedon, specifically from the Miaphysites. who have exactly that worry. Look, you distinguish person from nature, and then you say there's two of nature's, to to this, to that, to all this, and then there's just one person. Well, at that point, person seems to mean nothing, because everything seems to be two and dual. Now, what I think I didn't make as clear in the first chapter, and instead just sort of like lay out this schema, or at least what I wish maybe I had made a little more clear, is that that's only really one move in Christologic for what I call what I agree with the label Neo-Chalcedonian project, which is to make Chalcedons basically congenial and acceptable to Cyril of Alexandria's focus on and the Miaphysite focus on the singular identity, maybe I say identity, or the oneness. And what I think I wanted to say is that the distinguishing is almost sort of a prerequisite for anyone who wants to adhere to Chalcedon rather than simply just reject it. But that the really innovative and interesting creative work that Maximus is a part of, but there's a line of other people, is to, as it were, re-relate them and reintegrate them. I try to underscore that with Maximus's use of perichoresis in Christology. And I think sometimes, like in surveys and stuff and overviews of Maximus's contributions to Christology, this does get left out. It's sort of like, well, what Maximus did is sort of dot the I's and cross the T's on what had already begun with Chalcedon. So if you're going to say there's two natures, well, there's no actual nature that's not enacted. And so there must be two activities that are proper to the two natures. And then he sort of comes along and deals with the perhaps most existentially thorny question of the wills, is specifically given in light of Gethsemane and stuff. So what he does is sort of follows through. He swings and follows through. He swings the Chalcedonian bat and follows through all the way. Whereas the argument that's sort of underlying what I do, especially in the first chapter, that I'm not sure I made very clear, is simultaneously the only way he can follow through is by revisiting and reconceptualizing the terms that began the whole line in the first place. And so you actually, remarkably, I think, you don't get, for Maximus, he's thinking in two directions. You can't get a proper duality of nature, activity, or will without rethinking at the same time the sense of is, the hypostasis, the oneness. There is no rethinking or extrapolating duality without rethinking, identity.
Yeah.
And so that is where I think he remarkably brings in perichoresis as the mode, what I don't know if I call it this or not, but what I want to call the existential, almost like factual mode of Christ, which isn't the same thing conceptually as the one subject or agent of Christ. And yet they're inseparable. In fact, there's no way you can separate the two. And so
in this case is what the two.
Sorry, what was
the two that you can't separate are?
I mean, nature's energies and wills. Yeah. And so what I think he senses, and I don't remember how much I gestured. It's been a while since I've looked at the book, but what I think he senses in the Miaphysite critique, which is a good critique, one that forces him and others to think a little harder and deeper, is that what they're saying is like, okay, fine, look, let's say Christ is one subject, and he has two natures like you all want to confess. Well, those natures, as we all agree, unless they're enacted, they're not real. So surely the two natures are enacted. But then if they're enacted, what are we saying? There's two actualities.
Right.
So that's a good critique, because it's like, well, look, so there's a hidden implicit Nestorianism in Chalcedon. And so he has to contend with that, right? And because what does it mean to say it's almost like you can, it's almost like and this is a little bit of an allusion to maybe some critique of some modern theology that I might have, but it's just an illusion for now. there's a way in which taking refuge in the sequence and logic and coherence of narrative can get us out of the more difficult questions or make us even avoid them. Absolutely. So the Chalcedonians can say, well, look, there's one subject, he has or possesses or something, two natures, and even after the union, there's two natures. And so when he goes to act, so that's sequential, first he's one, and you're imagining him abstractly as one. Then when he goes to do something, which of course, if you're in history, you got to do, you can't be in history and not act or be acted upon. When he goes to do that, he is, as it were, enacting two natures, which carry all the potencies proper, the formal powers and capacities proper to what he is, which is two whats. And so, so when he acts, he's sort of, and this you can see all the way down to the way that a lot of fathers do partitive exegesis on scripture. Well, look, here he's doing a kind of like a divine thing. Here he's doing right. And I think a lot of us at least agree that can be problematic if you just like on the surface, right? Like, well, here's doing the God thing. Then over here, he turns to do something kind of human. And then over here, and then here, some of them will say there's a kind of mix. You can see he's walking on water or whatever.
Yeah, it becomes like a Nestorian exegesis.
Exactly. Right. And it's interesting even within the Neo-Chalcedonians, I'm not always sure. Maximus, unsurprisingly, I think thought even deeper about this than a lot of them. And whereas someone like John of Caesarea, the grammarian, who's usually pointed to as sort of one of the earliest attempts at something like what scholars call Neo-Chalcedonian project, he doesn't do that. I mean, he's a little more okay with just saying, there's both in the gospel narratives. You see both. Maximus insists that always and everywhere they're both enacted. And that there's never a sense in which one is like Jesus never does something simply human. Even when he suffers, he does so divinely, right? He pulls on Cyril and all that. Even his sufferings are life-giving, and so they're also divine. So all of that to say, I think I'm sort of meandering here, but all of that to say, what I think the existential question isn't simply one about extrapolating and dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Like, well, so does he have two wills or not? Well, wills are activities of rational nature. And so since there's two activities, because there's two natures, there must be two wills, right? That's kind of like a nice, neat way to kind of do the survey. But the deeper issue is that the Miaphysites are right to worry that when you start going around saying that Christ has two activities, two actualities, right, that sounds like there's just like you said, two things in a room next to each other. Or maybe they're inseparable. Maybe they always sort of follow each other, like I don't know, like a asymptotic line or something, like sort of always close, but in simultaneous and parallel. But and so I think Maximus, to his credit, at least sees that that's not tenable either. Like there does need to be an answer for this. And the answer, I think, and this is where it gets weird, one answer, at least the main answer he gives, is a kind of distinguishing between actuality and what you might call personal existence. So since the person, so this is where we're doing the second move of re-relating. Since the person, it's actually because the person is in conceptual content not identical to nature of either kind. And of course, as I say in the book, he even says that about the Trinity. Then actually, when the person, or since the person of Christ is both, he himself becomes their one and only oneness, and their only, as it were, actual, or I might say existential or real, concrete relation, which means that the strictures which typically pertain to the way we relate natures conceptually, whether it's on sort of a vertical hierarchy, and certainly all the way up to sort of the highest and the lowest, those no longer apply. In fact, because they don't really relate to the way that Christ's natures relate to each other, in fact, are not the way that they initially seem to relate for us in conception. Instead, and that's why when he goes to act, they interpenetrate one another. They aren't simply just parallel and constantly both there. They're both there, whole and whole, holy and whole, like the whole perichoresis. So he takes that concept of perichoresis from the Trinitarian heritage and he applies it. The first really systematically to do so in Christology, the first in the patristic era. So why I bring up all this is because I don't I didn't know how else I don't know how else I would do it if I rewrote it now. But I feel like the first chapter, it does run the risk of, and I kind of think it's open to the critique of, one, well, isn't this hypostasis you're talking about kind of empty? And it's like, well, relative to what a nature is, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think that it has to be, in the sense that there are, in Christ at least, there's one person, two natures.
Mm-hmm.
If the person as such had the same content as the nature, well, then there couldn't be one and two. There'd just be a straightforward contradiction.
Right. And
or
yeah,
go ahead.
Just that part. Can the content of the second hypostasis be the divine nature?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because that's the next part. What I was going to say is, just because we have to distinguish conceptually person from nature, it's not as if the way the person relates to his nature, so yes, the Son is divine, is somehow external or alien to him, right? And that's the risk I'm running in all this. And I think it's the risk Chalcedon sort of inaugurates, really, is, and it's the reason why there's objections to it and all that, is that it's very hard for us not to think that our conceptual distinctions simply map onto real distinctions external to us. It's also hard, though, to think, well, since external to us, they're not real. Like, in the sense, I should actually say, not what I really want to say is they're not final. Then why do we even make the distinction in the first place? That would be the Miaphysite position, right? Well, so why do we have to do all these two natures to if they're not in fact real? It's like, or like at the end of Ambiguum 42, Maximus has this whole thing about Christ's four births, and he's unfolding, and he's like, Christ was born in time. He's born in a sense through a baptism. He's born as well in deification, but also sort of like at the end he says, but really, in fact, these are all one birth, and they're only distinct in thought. It's like, whoa, okay, hold on. You went like 32 paragraphs on this, and then just said, well, but in fact, they're really they're one and the same. So all that to say, it's not as if the second person of the Trinity somehow, like divinity is something it has to sort of gain, right? He has to gain, or he has to, or like is introduced. And the language I use there, I use like indifference. I say that the hypostasis is indifferent to his two natures. I'm sort of stealing that from the High Middle Ages, from Scotus. Indifference in the sense of not different, a point of indistinction, a point of sameness. Now, Scotus wouldn't want to say that about Christ, but I sort of take that, because what I'm trying to get at conceptually is the only way to re-relate person to nature in a way that is adequate to Christology is first to distinguish them, and then to rethink how they in fact relate in reality. And the risk is to think that the initial division conceptually is a real one. Another risk is to think that you don't need the original distinctions for fear of division. And I'm trying to walk a line between those and go beyond those. So when some have said, like, Jordan thinks that persons are like, or there's like a principled person that comes in, swoops in, and resolves these incommensurables. Well, I mean, one thing is I do have like textual support. Maximus certainly just in fact declares that in his dispute with Pyrrhus. And Pyrrhus himself is shocked at that statement, actually. He says nothing at all is in common between the two natures. And he says, no, only the hypostasis. But the point there isn't, okay, so you should imagine God. So what I'm getting at is actually the misunderstanding of that would be already to assume that creation is not incarnation, because what you have to do is imagine, well, okay, so Maximus is saying there's the divine nature, and then there's created nature, and then there's this person, and the person is sort of empty and therefore can receive both. And then this is as it happens, like it's an event, it's a process or something. And so that way of understanding it, I don't think is correct. It's actually more, if we're going to understand it anyway, it's almost like more correct to say that he is both of them in such a way that he generates their very distinction, which is an odd sense of identity for sure. And I do admit that. But all that to say is I think I don't know. I'm a little surprised at like some of the critiques of like, I think I feel like it's obvious that there are incommensurables conceptually.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know how to make sense of really any of the Christological controversies otherwise. I mean, Nestorius wouldn't have felt any need to say, well, look, God can't be born, unless he already thought being born and being God are incommensurable.
Yeah.
You know, and so, or Theodoret of Cyrus wouldn't begin with, here are three things about the divine nature we know. It's, you know, immortal, incorruptible, and so forth. And then he goes on to say, so, I mean, we need to be careful. And, you know, he edges closer to Nestorian depending on how you read him. But he begins with incommensurables. And Maximus does too. I mean, he doesn't begin with incommensurables, but he countenances them precisely because, and this will be the last point I make before I throw it back to you, we can kind of maybe have a little more of a discussion. Precisely because I don't think they're incommensurable is a judgment that's made relative to that, like a principle that distinguishes the two things incommensurable, right? So if I say, you know, on the level of species, the human being and the rock are not the same. That's true. I mean, the fact that they can be defined at all differentiates them. So they're incommensurable on the level of species, like relative to the level of the specific or the formal. But that doesn't mean they're in fact incommensurable unless reality itself simply conforms finally, right, to that which differentiates specifically. Like unless reality itself is just exhausted by what's formally true. And so what I would want to say is the two natures of Christ are incommensurable, abstractly conceived. I think Bulgakov says that. In the Lamb of God. I mean, his entire kenotic Christology is premised on the idea. I mean, for him, it's more about, right, foreknowledge, omniscience, and then the sort of seeming diminishment of those things in Christ. And he's got in a sense, more radical, almost take than I do on some of that. But it's very much antinomy that generates the problem in light of Christology. And so on that level, they are antinomies. They really are incommensurable. But the question then becomes, well, is that level all there is? And then the question becomes, well, is the fuller or the bigger picture or the whole picture simply a higher formal level, as would be true in Porphyry's tree, or is the formal distinction itself something that really is inappropriate to the higher level? And then the next question would be, well, can you think it if it is beyond form? Mm-hmm. So now we're getting into like the more mystical, spiritual sort of, I think, intuitions at work in his otherwise fairly scholastic looking Christology. So the last point I'll rest on for now, I do want to emphasize that the form of my critiques of things like analogy, participation, asymmetry, and my insistence on incommensurables and stuff like that, the form of the critique isn't a negation, like simply. It's an inadequation. So I don't say, for example, that analogy is just wrong or participation is just wrong. That's not even textually true. Maximus does use that language. But it's just that it's not adequate to the fuller positive thinking through of the mystery of the incarnation. And so I don't see anything wrong with saying, like, you know, immortality and mortality are incommensurable by definition. They wouldn't be defined unless they were defined as opposites. But as Maximus says in letter 14, God is great, quote, because he can achieve and create the opposites through their negations. He says that. It's not Hegel. He says that, right? Although maybe there's some resonance, but right, as both is our thought. So it's not really a problem for me if there are antinomies or if the two natures are incommensurable. The problem would be if the level at which they are judged to be incommensurable is absolute.
Yeah.
And that I would say clearly Maximus doesn't think. Yeah. Anyway, those are some like random, you know, thoughts that I've had while you were talking and for a little while, and I'm sorry they weren't as clear as yours were.
No, it's really helpful. I love the just the the way you sort of dig into that Chalcedonian question, and our temptation, I think you're right, and I see this as well, the temptation to sort of find a way where those questions we don't need to ask them. Two, if the last thing we have to say about the duality of Christ is that there are two wills or two activities, then we quit too early, because now you've just got something sort of broken. You've just kind of like you said, that is sort of Nestorianism with the two bits glued together or something. I think where I want to push, though, I think is I'm even okay with the word incommensurable, but as the more you talked about incommensurable, it became like you used the word opposites. And like an example of a person in Iraq. Well, I think the reason, and I think this is Bulgakov too, the tension, the distinction, the infinite difference between the divine and the human natures is that is not one of opposition, but it's one of participation. It is that the divine nature is the pattern on which the human, all created nature takes shape. So yeah, maybe tell me how that sounds, or work with that.
What's tough is, okay, so I like the intuition behind that. And clearly I'm on that side, right? Like I feel like we've more fundamentally agree in terms of like, we don't want this separation. We don't want this chasm. What I'm afraid of a little bit is that participation, rather than like elucidating a lot, just kind of reframes the question such that it's no longer problematic. And there's a lot of reasons why I think that's an issue. For one thing, it isn't clear to me that participation does anything more than act as what David Hart once called about analogy. He said of analogy was a placeholder. All right, well, that's empty, if anything is. So a placeholder for what is the question? Whose place is it holding? So the absence suggests a more positive and fuller account, which is, as it were, we're awaiting. And I think the same is here. So like, just take an example, book 10 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. What is the most proper human activity? When are we most human? You've probably taught this text before, right? It's the contemplation, it's sort of, we can cynically say, well, it looks quite a lot like Aristotle, like what he does, but let's not be cynical. Let's say he's right in the sense, let's just say he's right, that rational contemplation, speculative insight into truth for its own sake, right, rather than for any utility. This is in a sense when we're most human, because it's when we're perfecting that which distinguishes us formally from everything else that we know of. Yet even there, Aristotle senses, he says, but since it's transitory, it isn't divine. He doesn't say it's participation in the divine exactly, because he's got his own critiques of participation. But nevertheless, you might say he's at least opening the door to the idea that we can piecemeal, partwise, take part of the activity of the which is proper to divinity. But one of the things that qualifies that activity about divinity, which is not applicable to humans, at least on this, it doesn't seem to be, is eternal contemplation, unbroken, unflagging, perfect, rather than sort of waning or ups and down or have a moment or something like that. And he has that interesting moment where he says, so either we will, and he's like sort of agnostic about, say, beyond this life, either we sort of will go on, and as he doesn't say this word either, but he might say become deified, and so fully be divine in that sense. But then that seems to erase what makes us distinguished as humans from the gods. Or we won't attain that, and so we'll never become gods. And so the best we can hope for is this sort of provisional, sporadic, participation in the divine activity. So I think like there, the dilemma is itself funded by antinomy. And he's just saying, I don't know which one it is. So I think you could describe there him allowing for participation, but also sensing that participation itself would more or less just kind of hold the place of the dilemma, which was the original source of the language of participation itself. I think Plato and the Parmenides plays with the same thing, and not in terms of contemplation, but in terms of whether or not participation really elucidates anything. The other big, yeah, go ahead.
Example there, and don't lose that thought. But so I think participation does more than hold a place, and I think and participation analogy, if you're thinking of analogy in an ontological way, it's sort of participation. So
right.
But I'm thinking of Athanasius does it first, but then it gets picked up by the Chalcedonians later. And you made me think of it with the reference in Nestorius and the question about the birth question. If being born is not the sort of thing that a divine nature can do, then we need to split them apart.
Mm-hmm.
And the impulse that I'm hearing in what you're saying, I think which is right, is to say, let's not try to fix the Nestorius problem by making him not a contrast, by saying however we do it, by sort of saying, but some sort of monophysite, pushing towards a monophysitism, I suppose. But what you get in first Athanasius and then later on is the sort of they wrestle with that problem, and then they say, well, what if the analogy is between begetting and being born?
Mm.
So it's nice for Athanasius because there's just like a one-letter difference, and so they almost rhyme. There's like they are very close, very tight analogy. And then what you have is a created nature for whom something like being born is an appropriate attribute, and that is patterned on or participates in a divine nature in whom it turns out mysteriously that begetting is a natural, appropriate attribute. So in that sort of way, if participation actually has ontological weight to it. It says this is actually so, and that's what I see sort of going on in Christ. I see him as the hypostatic union of the born and the begotten. Mm-hmm. There's an analogy between the two, but that doesn't over-identify them. That lets them be distinct.
So my worry there is that Christ is both. Like he is both begotten and born. So he's got to be more than an analogy between the two, since he himself is both, and he himself being both is actually what allows them to be related at all on even a conceptual level. Like a one subject who does both of those problematizes the initial relation between those, because he himself is the only way that they actually are like factually relate, even though they can relate in manifold ways, conceptually or metaphysically. Like, so that's the other probably like other side of this, or the other pull for me that's pulling. On the one hand, I think like Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus, I do think that they think there is something like a contrast, right, between eternity and time. Yes, they think it can be bridged. I don't think they think it's absolute in that sense. It's not that it's not an absolute dualism by my lights, at least. Although I think it's a little more complicated sometimes when people say, but whatever. Let's just say it's not an absolute dualism. But then the event of the incarnation itself deepens, you might say, sort of reveals problems that we perhaps wouldn't have sensed otherwise. So I can understand me relating me as a human being who's a participant, being born in time and play and space, who in some sense is imaging or patterning or even right, yeah, participating, right, sort of expressing in my own particular modalities something that's also true in the Trinity of God. That I can make sense of. So exemplarism as a metaphysics makes sense to me on that level. It's just that in Christ that just doesn't suffice. It's not that there aren't two subjects there to then be related analogously. So, and it's not like you can lessen the is on either side to be like, well, he's, and this is what I do think, and I think somewhere in that first chapter I take aim at this. I think a lot of times there is an operative, subtle but operative sense of, well, I mean, Christ is really like, he's really more God in a way than he is human, which actually then creates conceptual space for like something like, so analogy is doing the real work, because fundamental to who the second person is his divinity. I mean, certainly if you and I don't think we're like on one side as opposed to this other side, but if you have something like an Augustinian or a Thomist view of the incarnation is more or less merely a response to the fall, something that is not at all a primordial truth or something that has to be in order for creation to occur at all, then this is even more so the case, right? It's like it could have happened a lot of different ways. It might not have happened at all. There's nothing intrinsically revealed about the relationship between God and the world in the Son's incarnation. And so in that sense, it does make, or even in Scotus's version, it makes sense to say like the Son is more divine than he is human. I don't think that works though. You probably don't either. But then if it doesn't work, and I know it's odd to say it this way, but I feel like I have to, just in view of the polemics. He's just as much human as he is divine. That's what it means to say he's naturally human as much as he is naturally divine. Then I have to say we can't lessen the is. He is God. He is man. We can't lessen either of them, and he is the is of both, which is to say he is participated and participant in himself, just as much as he is made and unmade, just as much as he is born before the Father, from the Father before all ages, and also in these latter times from the Virgin Mary. So that's where I see again the critique isn't participation is incoherent. The critique is it's inadequate given this. And so that's why I don't feel like I need to negate participation. I don't even need to reduce it merely to a conceptual thing. Like, I think there's something really true. And in fact, I might even put it really kind of, if I want to be real provocative, like as if right, the book itself isn't. Most of what we experience is actually confined to what I'm calling the limits of participation. Like that is actually this current existence. It is mostly just participation in that sense. I mean, I'm being incorporated into the body of Christ, but I'm not fully who I need to be as a member of the body of Christ. And that not yet is itself the difference between participation and what I would call something like a Colossians 3:11 pan-Christism. So that's another reason why participation feels like it's enough, is because it actually is adequate to most of our actual experience, I think. But that doesn't mean it's adequate to be a little bit shameless here, the whole mystery of Christ, right? so that's go ahead.
I plan to be quiet, but I just I can't resist at this particular moment, because there's a thread that I've been kind of following as I go through, and I am a layman and just like a weird autodidact, so I may be way off base here. But there seems to me to be, I keep thinking about Barfield as you were just talking there, because like final participation is a willful participation. So like the proper and final participation for a human being has to be a willed and hypostatic participation. Is that a possible way of bringing you together here?
I think so. I mean, and This is also why I think it's useful to go to, like, I mean, Maximus. I don't know if I like this category always just because the way it's used, but say the mystics, right? I think that sometimes gets them marginalized, actually. But I think we all here agree that, mysticism and metaphysics and stuff are not like two totally different things or whatever. Um, one of the last, like, a willed participation, right? There's a way in which one of the last obstacles we may or may not, I'll just say we might have to overcome, is our presumption that surely I could never be you.
Hmm.
Right, we have Saint Epiphanius saying to Adam, in his sermon on the on Easter, right, saying, harrowing hell, saying to Adam, "You and I are one and the same person."
Yeah, we do this through the imagination all the time,
All the time.
which is why,
Right.
Again, this is why Barfield comes into play here for me.
Right. Or, I was reading like St. Gertrude of Health. She's some of the stuff she says about the union with Christ there, right? It's not just, and that's where I think Maximus, in his more technical application of perichoresis, is useful, because actually I think it makes the mystical expressions less just like sort of poetic, ornate metaphors in the sense of not really the way it is, but we got to say something. It's like it really is neither literal nor metaphorical. I use that language in the book rhetorically in response to those that call Maximus's statements metaphor, but
One might even say poetic.
Yeah, poetic in the true sense, right?
Yeah,
right, in the true sense,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That I mean, language itself, I follow that line that others have already articulated. Like, language itself, sort of, what begins metaphorical becomes literal. Like, that's the transfiguration of language, and I think that will also be the case for all things. But like, we can, like, so we're okay with citing, like, for 1 Corinthians 15:28, God will be all in all. But also Colossians 3:11, Christ is all and in all. That means Jesus, the one he's been talking about, right? Whoever the author is in Colossians the whole time. Jesus, who was crucified, he who's the image of the invisible God, firstborn among the dead. He is all good. Yeah. He in whom your life has been hidden, so that when he is manifest, you yourselves will be manifest. So, like, as if we're inseparable. Right, as if we indwell each other, as if John, right, I'm the vine, you're the branches, and may they be one as as we are one. Well, how are the Father and the Son one? Right, they indwell each other. So, so I think that that's what maybe I would want to say. Like, so that's the other thing. Like, look, I don't want to be like the anti-participation guy. It's sort of like a raining on everyone's parade or something. It's really not my point. In one way, my critique is really precise, right? It's more key to certain versions of participation and the limits that people deduce from them. But also, it's to say, I wouldn't say it's a placeholder. I would say it's an understanding along the way that, but that is, if we're thinking through Christology as in creation as incarnation, then we can say more than that, I guess, is what I want to say. I'm like, you're never going to rid, right? I mean, another key word for participation metaphysics is likeness, right? Like, Plotinus has this. He has two versions of likeness. I mean, it's all very, and you have, right, in Philippians 2, that he's in the likeness, right, of human flesh. So Cyril says it. Max was thinking one spot I found says something like participate, like in Christology proper, right? Like, where I'm saying that's not totally adequate. So there's a way in which it's a kind of colloquial and intuitive way to express something that I think, what I'm saying is, when we think through deeper, opens up to something a little bit more, I suppose.
Nate, are you ready for me to open the Mariology door?
Yeah, do it. Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about it before. So go for it.
Yeah. So this is I'm actually I'm bringing this up only because of your invitation, because it's a little bit of but in this I mentioned this the Jonathan Beeler critique in recent modern theology, and one of he's got a Mariology critique of your the big creation as incarnation thesis, and the way I would say it is, I think he's wrong, but I think he's wrong only because participation saves you. Saves
Okay.
from Beeler critique. And it goes like this: the critique is, he would, this is a super watered down way of saying it, but the upshot seemed to me to be, creation can't be, incarnation can't be identical to creation, because when Mary, the creature, responds to God, the creator, she needs to be talking to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
This is not an internal monologue. She's talking to someone else. My thought about that is, I mean, to me, it connects with what you're saying about, like, in some ways, the whole Nestorian question about acts and wills, and what if there's two, how do they map, and all of that. For me, it's Mary's creation is the incarnation is creation in this sense, because Mary's yes is it maps temporally onto the yes that Jesus gives in the garden, which maps eternally onto the affirmation of the Father by the Son. So it's not that they don't need to be separate, but if they're united, they're not an identity. But what they are is they are patterned on that relationality. So Mary can say yes. Ultimately, Mary can say yes because in all of eternity, she's always saying yes, because her yes is the Logos's yes.
Right. Yeah. No, I like that. And that's, yeah, I think with Beeler, I've met Jonathan before. He's a good guy, and he's he's Maximus scholar in his own right. So I think a lot of the critiques basically amounted to kind of what I don't mean to denigrate, it's just the word that it comes to mind, like kind of picture thinking. Like, well, look, Mary's here, and so there's got to be God and Mary, and they sort of have to relate externally, like as if they're on a stage and they're characters, and they just have to kind of talk to each other. Of course, the question is how the stage got there. That's really what I'm getting at. And is it the case that I have to choose one or the other? Or is it maybe the case that God becoming a character is the same thing as God creating the stage and so forth? So I think most of the time theologians are more or less captive to sequential thinking or spatial thinking or picture thinking, and they just sort of link things. And once they find resonance, they're like, okay, that's good. That's good enough. What I think the incarnation forces us to do is to say more again. It's like, yes, that's fine. That's a fine beginning. Like, it's like a fine apprehension. I like what you're saying, which is more. You are going beyond that, and you're saying, well, like Mary's yes is eternal. Mary was also born in time and spoke the yes in time. And once again, we could go sort of conceptually and be like, well, okay, so which is it? Which came first? Well, we have the same problem because, well, she's the same person. Mm-hmm. And what I love about, say, this is going to seem like I'm jumping way ahead, but you all know it's connected. It's what I love about Eriugenes Periphysion in the 5th book, in the last division, which is he who neither is created nor creates. It's the last division of nature. Well, that book is mostly about we might call his version of the Totus Christus. It's where you get the most like Eucharist is ubiquitous sort of language that is taken up later in other traditions. It's the whole Christ. It's where I really think Eriugena fully appropriates, or more than he does anywhere else, Maximus. And that's something I've changed my mind on since the book, actually. Is I was a little harsher on Eriugena than I probably should have been. But what's so great about that is, let's think about this. In one perspective, there is something achieved. Like, the typical way to do this is Mary is an idea in God's mind from eternity. then she's sort of brought into existence. Like he grants her, I don't know, existence in addition to her essence, which is in his mind formally or ideationally or something. And she goes through space-time, does the stuff, responds, right? And depending on which tradition, right, she ends up in eternity again, whichever method. And the question is, well, like, what is that? Is that a line or a cycle? Or is it, as I want to say, it's both at once, which is to say neither alone. Yeah. And so this is where I think Chalcedon's symmetry, which in Neo-Chalcedonianism becomes reciprocity or perichoresis. And then if you want to, with Maximus, apply this to the God-world relation itself, and not all the Neo-Chalcedonians did. That is something that's more distinctive of him, I think. I mean, it is distinctive of him, as far as I know. That leads to some wild things. And so I'm with you, like Mary's yes is eternal. It's also temporal. It's also both of them. And she herself is in the Word, whom she births, but also who births her. Another reciprocity. She herself is also Christ. I mean, surely she could say, if anyone could, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ is in me. I mean, that was all the way down to the flesh true for her. It's also beautiful. And by the way, I should say, you guys picking up on Mariology is great, because I had a section planned on Mary for that 4th chapter, which you could tell was like already way too, I had to jettison it. But what the text I was going to focus on was in Bigium 5, where Maximus makes the point. It's almost in passing, but it's an amazing point, is that Mary, phenomenologically, like historically, according to our perception, because she herself becomes a coincidence of opposites. When the Son, it becomes a coincidence of opposites. Mm-hmm. He says, because he makes her virgin and mother.
Oh, yeah. I remember that bit.
These are opposites. So see, I'm back to the opposite thing again. It's not that the opposites are final. It's that they're necessary to grasp the whole.
No, that's good. I like that.
And so what you end up getting is the mode of the Trinity itself, which is perichoresis, which I would say with Bulgakov here, it's just as much true that the divine nature is achieved, so to speak, in the mutual indwelling of the love, as it is that the divine nature is itself the power for them to indwell. Right? Those are, because the reciprocity is all the way down.
That's good.
And so that's the mode of the Trinity, what he calls in Bigium 5 the mode of the Lord's existence, right? The tropos tisi parxeos. Mm-hmm. And that, which is typically more easily understood as this, like a horizontal sort of level, whether you're talking God or us or something, it's tipped like this too. Mm-hmm. And now it's the vertical relation, which is otherwise unthinkable. Yeah. That she is the condition for the incarnation, just as much as the incarnation simultaneously is the condition for her being Theotokos. And these are simultaneous, and they mutually, reciprocally condition and even in a sense cause each other, including her will, her yes. And I've had somebody ask me once when I said this, like, well, how did God, like, so what, does God like know she's going to say yes? And it's like, well, okay, it's already a wrong question, because you're sort of acting, again, you're putting it back in the sequence, back in the narrative, back in the drama that simply goes one scene after the other, as if God has to wait. But also, and this is where I think it's so important to see the logi are not simply ideas. The reason why she could be, as it were, ground zero for incarnation, and for me, therefore, creation, right? The burgeoning, the creation from nothing of the beginning and the end in the middle, is because God knows her. There's no other way to know whether or not she will say yes unless you already know her completely. Mm-hmm. Like in an analogy to like my dad, I know for a fact that he's not going to, if someone came to the door and said, your dad just killed somebody for no reason, I would say, no, he didn't. And they said, well, how do you know? Did you conduct an investigation? I'm like, no, I know him. You got it wrong. Or he's out of his mind, or something happened, right? In a sense, he's not him. He's not the one I know, right? So it's so crucial then when Maximus says that the Loki are he instead of picking up the paradigm language, the patterning type language that is in Dionysius, right there, even when he pulls from the same passage, he calls them wills, and he says this is how God knows. He knows as he wills, as he loves, as he knows, as he wills, as he loves, and logi are all of that. And so that's almost like an intersubjective, I don't know if that's the right word, but like sort of this personal knowledge. And so what's so difficult is like you have to begin with the narrative, but the narrative itself, I would argue, forces you to go beyond the narrative, not to negate it, but to sublate it. I don't know, to the narrative doesn't actually make sense otherwise, unless the logic governing the narrative is itself not narratival strictly. So that mutual, it's like the perichoresis of perichoresis between Son and Mary. Well, and so I would want to argue in the end, just to throw something else out there and then stop. The reason why she's virgin and mother is because like she's mother because she bears the son. She's virgin because she is, in a sense, the first, or simultaneous with Christ, the first flesh, the first creation. Not that, I mean, Christ is the firstborn of all creation, right? But he is that as he makes her that too, and vice versa. Like this to me, and this is where I'm with Bulgakov again, it's the kenosis of God that explodes our preset logics.
Yeah.
It explodes them. It doesn't destroy them, though. Maybe I shouldn't say explode, but it certainly exceeds them. And yeah, so that's where I would start to go. But I wonder what you guys think more about connections with Mary.
Yeah, Nate, that's your cue.
No, I'm still processing. That was good though.
I've got while you're processing, just on one of those notes, Jordan, I've got a diagram that I use in class, and I'm a terrible drawer, so it's always lots of fun for everyone. But it's a perichoresis diagram that shows kind of the perichoresis of perichoresis. Trinity as perichoresis, creation as perichoresis, and then the hypostatic union as perichoresis, which brings creation up into full union with God. So becomes the sort of the whole story in a sense is
that's awesome. Yeah, that's so, that's so it's so difficult to think, and I lose the thread sometimes. I'm not saying I figured all this out. It's just what it requires is us to loosen the grip on what was initially in a sense provisionally necessary for us to get off the ground.
Yeah.
And not take it that just because it was necessary that it's therefore final.
Yeah.
And just because you go beyond it doesn't mean you negate it. Mm-hmm. Like those sorts of dynamics. And I just, for me, that's like the only way this doesn't feel necessary, or it almost feels like boldly or audaciously just speculating for whatever reason, is if, and I think this is where this to me is honestly where the real dividing line is. I mean, I know we have like different people have different ways they want to do this or different ways to execute it. But to me, like one of the most fundamental dividing lines in I think Christian theology today, and Tony, you would know better than I would on this, but is whether or not you think, let's just put it this way, the incarnation is integral to creation or not. Like to me, so much more follows from that. Like to me, that's the heart of the sophologists. That's the heart of someone like Eriugena and Maximus. That's the heart of Eckhart. Like that's, and there's different ways to do it, and people could critique or change or want to do different details or different ways to think it. But that's, to me, that's because if you don't think that, right, if you think like, well, I don't know, you could have done something different. Maybe the Father could have been incarnate, or as some scholastics wildly said, like the divine nature by itself could have been incarnate. Or maybe not at all, right? Maybe God just would have never responded, although Anselm wouldn't want that. But like, if you think it's more or less extrinsic or almost arbitrary, then none of this is necessary to think through at all.
Yeah. When I I don't know if it was when I first saw the title of the book or when I sort of read enough of the first few pages that I understood what you're doing with the title. But my very first response was, "Oh, this is divine humanity. This is Soloviev and Bulgakov, and that's because their divine humanity is not the historical incarnation. It is everything that the incarnation is eternally within the divine being. It's eternally
Yeah.
God is also that."
And what's funny to me, I mean, what's kind of remarkable to me about this, I actually hadn't read a whole lot of them before I really got into Maximus, which is nice because then I can kind of say with integrity, like actually they might not be just wildly speculating because they read Buma or whatever.
Right.
Like, it's like some of this stuff was pretty much there in the heart, and someone you consider a pillar of orthodoxy is willing to say certain things, willing to say God suffers in the suffering of all, willing to say that Christ is completed by me as I'm saved, right? Willing to say God and man are paradigms of one another. Yeah, no, but it's been delightful to see, and I've had to kind of revisit, and I'm still reading through. I'm doing I'm going to be writing an essay on Eriugena and Sophiology for next year. And
saw this
so,
new, you saw it, but I saw this new book on the patristic roots of the sophiologists.
yeah, it's Plested, I think.
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah,
right.
yeah. I haven't read it yet. Yep. But anyway, I think as soon as you see like what Maximus says in question 60, that this incarnation, right, the hypostatic union, which he defines there in the second paragraph, he says, which brings into perfect identity in every way humanity and divinity. So that's what this is. He says,
Yeah.
this is the sake, this is the preconceived goal, this is the divine counsel, this is the sake, that for which everything else exists, and which itself exists for the sake of nothing more. I'm like, this is creation. Everything, all the ages, all the beings in those ages have received their beginning and end in Christ. So like this, if you think that, and then you have to think, following Chalcedon, bidirectionally. Well, if that's true, and Christ is just as much human as he is God, then what does that say then when you think back through to God? And what does that say if you think forward from God to humanity? And what does it say about the fact that you got to think both directions at once? And that, yes, it's bizarre and it leads to weird things and it sort of upsets preset frameworks, or at least seems to. But to me, that's the force of the necessity that I have. It's like I'm willing to countenance other, prima facie bizarre possibilities, not just because I want to be an edgelord, but because I feel like otherwise I'm just not. I just have willed not to think through it anymore, and I suppose that's a possibility, but
Yeah, I'm
not
thinking
one I
about
want to take.
thinking about that bit that you started with about well, I can't remember the language, but Maximus gives us the four births of Christ, and then he comes to the end and says, but they're all the same, they're all one. And so that's connecting. That feels like, I feel like that connects several threads in our conversation. Because there's that, and this is part of what I started with, was that the sort of the deep spirituality of Maximus and everything that he writes. He'll make these distinctions. He will, here are the fundamental distinctions within being. And then when we get to the human, we find out that the human's role, and you work with this passage some too, that the human's role is to unite all that's different. Like that's part of our deification, is we become the sort of the Christological uniting of all this difference. And what that's got me thinking about now is the way that you're using the language of conceptual distinctions. So back to my example of Jesus being born from Mary and being begotten by the Father before all the ages. We need to first say, as all the church fathers say, well, those are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
You can't. There's not there. Those are infinitely distinct, and nobody can argue otherwise. We make that distinction. But then I think Maximus, part of the journey of theosis is as we move deeper into God, we find the way in which the things that will always be different are not, going to go back to this word, oppositional. So these are real different things. And somewhere along the way on the journey of theosis, I realized that well, I don't know how to say what I realized because I'm not deified yet, but I realized something about how these things are one without being being to one another.
Well, you'd be Tom Bombadil.
How
You'd be Tom Bombadil, because like this is what that thing that you're talking about. Like this is like the power of naming that we have lost. Like that is precisely the art of naming things properly is what we have lost, and that's why we can't do that. That's why we can't unify things. And as you can see in the example of Bombadil in Tolkien, like it's a poetic art. It's like everything he only talks in song and rhyme.
Yeah,
and he's constantly singing.
That's good. Yeah. So, yeah. So if you can properly see, yeah, there's like, I hope that one day what I experience is that to say the word God is to say everything.
Right.
And to say to name properly any one thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And yes, precisely. Yeah. Which is what brings the unity. Yeah. Like, and the unity is, and the Bible is like very clear about this link between unity and name. Like that's a constant thematic link. I also think that there's some kind of like there's clearly some kind of link between naming and hypostasis too, because it's like, well, in order to be a being capable of naming, you have to be hypostatic. You have to have a hypostatic existence, otherwise you would have no power of naming.
Or being named.
Or being named, exactly.
Yeah. The white stone. And it's there's a remarkable passage. I can't remember which ambiguum it is, but where, and this to me reminds me of Gregory of Nyssa's in Iliad, where he says something similar. But Maximus says that, like he's sort of meditating on what it means for Christ to be the Lamb of God, offered, consumed, and so on. And he says that Christ makes himself the very property of Paul that distinguishes Paul and Peter. It's almost exactly something that an earlier, I think it was Macarius or something, had denied. It's because it's fine to say, well, Christ is human, so he takes on the moniker, the predicate.
Well, he's the Word, right? Which is links it right back to this idea of naming that I was just talking about.
Yeah, exactly, and the power of language, right? And I think what happens sometimes, and I don't think this is true of the people that are influencing you, Nate, because the way you talk is different. but it's there's a temptation, I think, to think, poetry is sort of what you do when you don't do science. It's like the other thing that language can do, which is just a different function, and it's just not what it's almost like it replays the very formal distinctions or incommensurabilities that we've been talking about in other contexts, where it's like, well, this is what you do when you're conceptualizing something, and so knowing it, you're gaining quantitative knowledge or whatever you want to call it, and then when you want to sort of do something else, you turn away from that and you do the kind of like, you compose poetry or sonnets or whatever, and so in that sense, poetry becomes the bad infinite. You just revel in it rather than call it bad. So you just call it the good, bad infinite, where you would be like, yeah, this is great. I love this sort of never ending flux. I'm just expressing, there's a sense of romanticism in it. And I think, of course, from the perspective that I'm thinking through, through Maximus, who definitely doesn't ever talk about poetry or anything, but it's just that can't be the truth even of language itself. It can't be that it's just one or the other, that there needs to be a perichoresis of the functions, so that the fullness of the power of language, which mostly we don't experience, or we do piecemeal and in certain moments and so forth, that we all call beauty. that's like that is giving us a proleptic sense of the eschatological, which really is the only thing that's true and real. So so much of our like presumptions about limits and interpreting the limit, that's the other thing too, is like limits have to be interpreted. That's another way of putting another major theme that I've been trying to bring up. It's one thing to identify a limit, but then you have to then say how that relates to anything else. And so what I see in this perspective, this creation, this incarnation, this deification, all this sort of integrating all of this, is to push and say, look, of course there are limits, but the limits themselves need to be interpreted. And ultimately, if they're interpreted by the word incarnate, then the fullness of the power of language, concepts, art, everything is ultimately there. It's disclosed there. And sure, we're constantly trying to think through and rethink and but that's yeah. So
that's good. That surely must be right. That the limits of creation are limits that language only makes sense. We can show limit as itself a kind of relation,
right? And I think that was maybe the last, like, it's already in the creed. That's the other thing I want to say. It's like there, it's buried like a treasure in a field. It's like, it's funny, right? The Nicene Creed doesn't use person, doesn't use hypostasis, just names them: Father, Son, and the Spirit at the end. And then other names: Pilate, Mary. But let's follow it through, right? It's like the one who is begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. We'll just go down to the next paragraph, like became man, or even in the Latin version, it's clearer, was made. Begotten, not made, and made. So there, it's already there, right? And so the stuff we've been talking about, thinkers we've been talking about, they're the ones that are, have to think through what's sort of always already there.
That's good. It's in the creed. Can't argue with it.
right.
The songs
end of the story. Case closed.
The songs and the creeds often maintain things that we lose in the theology.
Yeah. So, yep. And in the New Testament itself, I think, and Scripture. So,
yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, any closing thoughts? This feels like a good place to end it.
So let's get a beer and keep talking about this at the next.
Yeah, time. Right. I could definitely keep going for sure. It was really great for you guys to join me today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nate, for having us. Thanks for hosting this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for having us, Nate. Thank you so much, Tony, for the time.
Yeah, for sure. Great to be with y'all.